The deadliest conflict in human history didn't start with a bang, but with a signature. When the ink dried on the peace treaties of 1919, the world breathed a sigh of relief, believing the war to end all wars was finally over. They were wrong. Instead of lasting peace, they had merely created a 20-year ceasefire. From the ruins of empires and the collapse of economies, new forces began to stir. Forces driven by resentment, hunger, and a thirst for revenge. This is the story of how the world walked blindly, step by step, into an even greater catastrophe. November 11, 1918. The guns fell silent across Europe, but the silence was deceptive. German soldiers marched home not as a defeated army, but in good order, welcomed by leaders who told them they remained undefeated on the field. This single lie planted a seed of doubt that would grow into a poisonous myth. The German people, starving from years of British naval blockades, expected a peace based on American President Woodrow Wilson's fair 14 points. What they got instead was a vengeful dismantling of their nation. The armistice wasn't a resolution, it was a pause button, pressed by exhausted nations that had forgotten how to live without war. 6 months later, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the victors dictated the future. The terms were crushing. Germany lost 13% of its territory and all its colonies. But the real blow was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept total responsibility for the conflict. Along with this admission came a bill, 132 billion gold marks. It was a debt so massive that economists like John Maynard Keynes resigned in protest, warning it would destroy the European economy. He was right. The treaty didn't just punish Germany, it humiliated a proud nation and created the perfect weapon for future demagogues to wield against the West. To prevent history from repeating itself, the world pinned its hopes on a new idea, the League of Nations. It was designed to settle disputes through talk, not tanks. But the organization was born broken. The United States, whose president had dreamed up the concept, refused to join. Without American industrial and military backing, the League was a policeman without a badge or a gun. It could issue warnings and write stern letters. But when powerful nations decided to break the rules, the League had no way to stop them. It became a debating club in Geneva, while the world outside began to burn. While the victors argued in comfortable halls, democracy began to die in the streets. Italy had been on the winning side, but its people felt cheated by the peace treaties and crushed by economic chaos. Enter Benito Mussolini. A former socialist turned nationalist, he promised to restore Roman glory. In October 1922, he didn't win an election. He simply threatened to take power by force. As his black-shirt paramilitaries gathered for the March on Rome, King Victor Emmanuel III panicked. Instead of sending the army to crush the rebellion, he invited Mussolini to form a government. The world's first fascist dictatorship was established not by conquest, but by a phone call. If Italy showed the political danger, Germany revealed the economic nightmare. In 1923, after France occupied the industrial Ruhr region to seize unpaid reparations, the German government responded by printing money, to pay striking workers. The result was insanity. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. In January, a loaf of bread cost 250 marks. By November, that same loaf cost 200 billion. People carried cash in wheelbarrows, and savings that took a lifetime to build couldn't buy a cup of coffee. The exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. Society unraveled, and in this chaos, fringe radicals like Adolf Hitler saw their chance to strike. For a few years, things looked up. The Golden Twenties brought stability, largely funded by American loans, keeping the European economy afloat. Then came October 1929. The Wall Street crash didn't just bankrupt American investors, it pulled the plug on the entire world. American banks recalled their loans, and Europe's fragile recovery shattered. In Germany, unemployment skyrocketed to 6 million. Desperate, hungry men stood in bread lines looking for answers. The moderate center could offer only austerity and patience. The extremes, communists on the left and Nazis on the right, offered action. The Great Depression didn't cause the war, but it loaded the gun. By 1933, the German parliament was paralyzed. Conservatives believed they could use the charismatic Nazi leader to control the masses, thinking they would push him into a corner so hard he would squeak. They were fatally mistaken. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor legally. Within 2 months, he turned the chancellorship into a dictatorship. The pivotal moment came with the Enabling Act in March. Stormtroopers lined the hallways of the Opera House where the vote took place, chanting threats at the deputies inside. The vote was 444 to 94. Democracy in Germany didn't fall to an invasion. It voted itself out of existence. While Europe smoldered, the first actual shots of the next war were fired in Asia. Japan, controlled by an aggressive military caste, looked at the resource-rich province of Manchuria with hunger. On September 18, 1931, Japanese officers staged a clumsy explosion on a railway line near Mukden. It was so minor that a train passed over the tracks minutes later, but it was enough. Blaming the Chinese, Japan invaded. China appealed to the League of Nations. The League investigated, issued a report, and condemned Japan. Japan's response? They simply walked out of the meeting and never returned. The lesson was clear to dictators everywhere. Aggression would not be punished. Mussolini watched Japan's success and decided it was his turn. In October 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations left in Africa. It was a massacre. Italian planes dropped poison gas on soldiers armed with outdated rifles and spears. The Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, went to the League of Nations and delivered a haunting prophecy. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. The League imposed sanctions, but, fearing war, refused to ban the one thing Mussolini needed: oil. The sanctions annoyed Italy without stopping the tanks. The system of collective security had officially failed. Hitler was a gambler, and in 1936 he placed his biggest bet. The Treaty of Versailles forbade German troops from entering the Rhineland, the buffer zone bordering France. Hitler's generals warned him that the German army was too weak to fight, and if the French moved, they would have to retreat in humiliation. On March 7th, a handful of German battalions marched across the bridges. They carried orders to turn back immediately if the French army appeared. But France, paralyzed by political infighting and fear, did nothing. Britain shrugged, calling it Germany walking into its own backyard. That weekend, Hitler learned that the West had lost its will to fight. That summer, a civil war erupted in Spain. It became the testing ground for the new weapons of war. While Britain and France stayed neutral, refusing to send arms to the democratic government, Hitler and Mussolini poured in troops, tanks, and planes to support the fascist rebel General Franco. The world watched in horror as the German Condor Legion bombed the town of Guernica, targeting civilians deliberately to test the psychological effect of air power. It was a preview of the terror that was coming for London and Warsaw. The dictatorships were working together, learning how to kill, while the democracies simply watched. In Asia, the conflict exploded into full-scale war in July 1937. Japanese forces swept south from Manchuria, capturing Beijing and Shanghai. When they reached the capital, Nanking, in December, discipline vanished completely. For 6 weeks, Japanese troops unleashed a campaign of terror that remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners were murdered. The brutality was so extreme that even the Nazi representative in the city, John Rabe, was horrified and set up a safety zone to save Chinese civilians. The world was shocked. But once again, shock did not translate into action. By 1938, Hitler wanted more. He annexed Austria in March without firing a shot, greeted by cheering crowds. Next, he demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. The Czechs had a modern army and strong fortifications, but they needed their allies, Britain and France, to stand with them. Instead, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to cut a deal. In a desperate attempt to avoid war, the Western powers handed the Sudetenland to Hitler. The Czech representatives weren't even allowed in the room. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper declaring, "Peace for our time." It was a delusion. The promise of Munich lasted less than 6 months. In March 1939, Hitler broke his word. German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, occupying Prague. This time, there was no pretense of uniting German speakers. This was pure conquest of a non-German people. The policy of appeasement died that day. Britain and France finally realized that Hitler could not be satisfied, only stopped. They drew a line in the sand at the next likely target, Poland. They pledged to defend Polish independence. But by now the German war machine was fully rearmed and confident. Hitler had one fear: a two-front war. He couldn't fight Britain and France in the West, while fighting the Soviet Union in the East. Stalin, the Soviet dictator, had been trying to form an alliance with the West against Hitler, but he was ignored and distrusted. So, the unthinkable happened. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, sworn enemies, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The world was stunned by the public non-aggression treaty. But the real danger lay in the secret protocol attached to it. The two dictators had quietly agreed to slice up Eastern Europe between them. Poland's fate was sealed. The tension broke at dawn on September 1st. Using a staged attack on a radio station as a flimsy excuse, German forces poured across the Polish border. This wasn't the trench warfare of 20 years earlier. This was something new. Blitzkrieg. Tanks smashed through defenses, dive bombers screamed overhead, and the Polish army was overwhelmed by speed and violence. 2 days later, Britain and France honored their pledge and declared war on Germany. But they could do nothing to save Poland, especially when Soviet troops invaded from the east 2 weeks later. The 20-year ceasefire was over. The nightmare had begun. World War II wasn't inevitable. It was a tragedy built on 1,000 small failures. It happened because victors wrote a vengeful peace, and because the desperate turned to strong men for easy answers, and because good nations stood by, while aggressive ones broke the rules. The lesson of those 20 years remains the most expensive history lesson humanity has ever paid for. Peace is not preserved by wishful thinking, but by the courage to confront aggression before it becomes unstoppable.